welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation with a change maker working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. You know, the world's progress toward a sustainable society has been charted by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. It's a set of 17 goals that include environmental, social, and economic projects deemed necessary to creating a just, equitable world that can live on its own current resources instead of borrowing from the future. The SDGs address people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships that we need to put in place by 2030. But they don't include animals. Animals are mentioned only once in 8,600 or so words that document the SDGs. Yet animals are key to our restoration of the planet, as our guests, Kate Wall and Mark Hofberg of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, pointed out recently in a report titled Thriving Together, the Critical Role of Animals in Achieving the SDGs. Mark is campaigns officer and Kate is senior legislative manager at the International Fund for Animal Welfare. When we take care of animals, we take better care of people. You can learn more about the International Fund for Animal Welfare at www.ifaw.org. IFAW, all one word, no dash, no space, ifaw.org. And we're going to include a link to the report in the article that accompanies this podcast, which you can find at earth911.com. Welcome to the show, Kate and Mark. How are you all doing today?
Very well. Thanks so much, Mitch, for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us on, Mitch.
Well, thank you for joining us. I want to start off, and you'll have to bear with me because this is a sort of long question. I want to read from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals language that refers to animals, which is in goal number 2. And this is called End Hunger, Achieve Food Security, and Improved Nutrition and Promote Sustainable Agriculture. So this is the language that refers to animals, the only language in all of the SDGs. By 2020, maintain the genetic diversity of seeds, cultivated plants, and farmed and domesticated animals and their related wild species, including through soundly managed and diversified seed and plant banks at the national, regional, and international levels, and promote access to and fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge as internationally agreed. That's the end of the quote. So here's my question. How do animals fit into a sustainable environment beyond serving as a source of food and genetic diversity?
Thank you for a really insightful question in so many ways. This is far too narrow a scope for looking at the incredible contributions that animals make to what is, in fact, Earth's life support system. We all depend on healthy ecosystems for things that we really take for granted, like the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the soil that grows our crops. And animals are an indispensable part of that. We are all part of this really complex web that I think most of us learned about in kindergarten, right? That web of biodiversity
and promptly forgot.
Right. We learned briefly and then we forgot that we're all part of this. And if we start taking animals, particularly native wild species, out of the landscape, then we start to see things collapse. We can't have healthy trees and soil and grasses if we don't have the animals that evolved to be part of those networks of ecosystems. And then we start to see water dry up. We start to see more impactful storms that, not only do we have storms as a result of climate change, but if we don't have the ecosystems like the trees and the grasses and the animals that help to keep them healthy, then we see less water retention. And so we see greater floods, greater impacts from the weather events that we deal with, more dryness so that wildfires are more severe. Really, if you start pulling on that animal thread, you unravel the whole ball of earth.
So this is a follow-up, and I want to go into some detail that you covered in the report. They're not referred to in any of the other SDGs, but animals do play a role in all of them. I've got a series of questions here. Can you tell us how large animals like whales and elephants contribute to biodiversity and help sequester carbon?
That's a great question. I always think about the example of the Yellowstone wolves, and how when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the 90s, over time we saw the ecosystem regenerate, because before wolves were reintroduced, there were too many herbivores that were actually preventing trees from regenerating. And the wolves controlled the herbivores, and there's this more balanced ecosystem. And then the water quality improved, the tree cover improved. And it's just an example of what happens when humans take an animal out of the picture. In this case, humans, hunted wolves to extirpation in that area. And then there was, a downstream effect. And then reintroducing them, we saw the restoration. So that's just like one example. But as far as there's a lot of research on what elephants do to the environment. They travel thousands of miles and they disperse seeds by eating the seeds and then releasing them in their dung. So they trample grasses and small trees, which allow other species to grow in the gaps. This is important to make sure that ecosystems are diverse. They create water holes that other animals use during droughts. It allows water to stay in the area. The list goes on. Whales are also extremely important in the ocean environment. They are nutrient circulators. They take nutrients from the equator. They take nutrients from where they feed, usually in higher latitudes, down to the more equatorial areas where they breed and calve. And some of them also circulate them they dive deep and then bring nutrients up to the top. And this is very important for the ocean ecosystems because you need that cycling in order for the rest of the species to survive. Now, all of these things I just mentioned, the wolves, elephants, and whales, all of those things that they do that help ecosystems thrive are also sequestering carbon, right? So I talked about more trees from the wolves. I talked about more diverse plant species from elephants. I talked about nutrient cycling from whales. Not only is that just good for biodiversity, it's also sequestering carbon. And so without that, we're going to have a much tougher time mitigating climate change.
Now, we also tend to think of oceans as mostly unexplored, and in some sense they very much are, but we've devastated animal populations there. Tell us about how marine species play a critical role in human health and prosperity, particularly as we look at how to feed an even more populated planet over the course of the next century.
Yeah, not only do oceans provide us with food, whether that be, fish and protein sources or vegetable sources like kelp and other sea vegetables that many communities depend on. They're also, as Mark started to touch on, they not only sequester carbon, they also produce 50% to 80% of the oxygen that we breathe on this planet. And animals are a huge part of the ocean ecosystem, just as they are part of the terrestrial ecosystem. So as we exterminate species from the ocean through either overfishing, pollution, or a changing climate, which has devastating impacts on ocean ecosystems, we're going to start to see the ocean ecosystems break down in ways that have, in some ways, expected and in many ways really untold and unknown impacts on human populations on land. Not only can we start to lose some of our traditional food sources, which we get from the ocean ecosystems, but also some of the benefits of those ecosystem services.
Now, the other area where our relationship with nature is particularly troublesome right now has to do with wildlife management and zoonotic diseases like COVID. When we talk about wildlife management, how should we be thinking about this? Is management even the right word to use? Or is it another reflection of an anthropocentric perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And management is the right word, but wildlife management is not necessarily the right word. It's actually people management. We have to manage ourselves in how we interact with wildlife. I think that's a better way of thinking of it. But when it comes to zoonotic disease, I think obviously in the last 3 years, it's become more at the front of our minds as far as like the very real impacts of zoonotic disease. Yeah. COVID is, clearly a very acute example of when, disease transfer from wildlife to people. But we've had this for a long time. HIV, AIDS, Ebola, SARS, the Spanish flu, all of these are examples of diseases jumping from wildlife to people. And zoonotic disease emergence is increasing, and most new diseases are coming from animals. So why is this happening? The risk of transfer or emergence is based on sustained contact with wildlife populations, or with specific wildlife. So think touching, being in close contact with, those kinds of things. And, that's not necessarily a natural thing. But it's something that's happened as we have industrialized the process of wildlife trade and exotic pets. So think like, primates and monkeys that people unfortunately buy and have in their homes, and things like that. So
how should we change the way we manage people then?
Right. So I think trying to move away from the trade in wildlife as an industrialized concept is something that we need to do as a species, as a civilization. Because if we are in constant contact with wildlife and wildlife parts and products, and then this is just going to keep happening. So if we want to avoid the next COVID, that's something that needs to happen. That's one example of how zoonotic disease emerges. Another way is by just so biodiversity itself has been shown, having a healthy ecosystem and biodiversity has been shown to reduce risk of zoonotic disease emergence. So that's another thing that we can work on.
So simply by the fact that nature is more diverse and therefore deals with the pathogen when it emerges is a form of protection that a lot of people simply ignore.
It's definitely a form of protection. And, a lot of something also I forgot to mention is when we're talking about animals and trade, there's really robust research on stressed animals and how that when they're stressed, it's the same thing with people. When you're stressed, you're more likely to get sick, right? Yeah. Because your immune system is suppressed and the viruses that are already inside you have a better chance of taking hold. And that's a lot of these animals they're carrying around these diseases, right? And that's not necessarily a dangerous thing. That's a natural thing. We all have microbes inside of us that, we're waging a daily battle with. But it's when they're in stressed environments, they're too close to each other, they're in cages. It allows these microbes to evolve and circulate among themselves and become these diseases like COVID that jump onto other animals or become more virulent.
So a wet market is almost like a petri dish where zoonotic diseases emerge.
Right. And so you can think of, say a wet market where there's, lots of contact between different species, sustained contact, lots of bodily fluids moving around. That's just, we kind of want to avoid that.
Now, the other area where animals are absolutely critical and we are at the precipice of disaster is with regard to pollination of essential crops and everything in nature. Where do we stand on supporting pollinator populations, and particularly with regard to heavily industrialized agriculture? Are we making progress?
That's a great question. As you probably know, I think it's 3/4 of flowering plants rely on animal pollination. and 35% of the crops that we eat as people require animal pollinators. So like you said, it's critical. And we must have a home for them. A lot of pollinators don't require much. I mean, we're talking about a lot of insects, small birds. Simple strips of native grassland is often a solution that works. But I want to also stress that pollination is a direct example of how animals are absolutely essential for agriculture. But there's so many other things that are direct, but also indirect. I talked about this simple strip of native grassland that's important, so that native bees can live on and allow to pollinate. But that simple strip of native grassland also provides for indirectly, soil health, drought mitigation, flood mitigation. And it's so thinking of it in terms of, okay, this is kind of like how we got into this problem in the first place. We kind of reductionist thought where it's like, well, okay, so now, we forgot about the pollinators. So now we need to have this one thing that's going to make sure we have pollinators. But then we're going to forget about all the other indirect things. And really the answer is just making space for natural ecosystems that provide all of these direct and indirect benefits. That's something that we need to think. It's a different way of thinking about it, right?
I definitely want to talk more about that topic in particular, the opportunity to rewild the environment. But we need to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back to talk more with Kate Wall and Mark Hofberg of the International Fund for Animal Welfare. We're back to continue talking with Kate Wall and Mark Hofberg of the International Fund for Animal Welfare about their recent report, Thriving Together, the Critical Role of Animals in Achieving the SDGs. The SDGs, of course, are the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So, Kate, let me ask you this question. Women have benefited from the growth of agriculture substantially over the past 200 years, but they're seeing a lot of opportunity and rights scaled back as the climate crisis worsens. And your report calls out that animals are an important source of income for women. What does society need to be thinking about in terms of investing to provide support for gender equality based on animal welfare? It's an interesting connection I hadn't really thought about a lot.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, at its base, I think gender equality is absolutely fundamentally necessary at all levels of society. Certainly within conservation, we know that when women have self-determination and control over their environments, conservation happens more often. And where agriculture is important for a community, it is important for women and men alike. But more fundamentally, women make up a little more than 50% of the global population. And when you don't have seats at the table for all of the people who are consuming the resources that we have and, engaging in the behaviors that are both beneficial and problematic to society, then you're never going to be successful in really tackling those issues. And not to get too far beyond the scope of this discussion, I mean, bringing women to the table, bringing 50% of our population to the table to discuss the most important issues that are facing our collective society, climate change, biodiversity loss, hunger, this just makes sense. And if we fail to do that, if we fail to allow 50% of the population to have the voice that it needs in these decision-making discussions, then we're never going to solve the issues that are facing us. So really, we all need to be holding our decision makers accountable, whether that is locally, regionally, nationally, internationally, for ensuring that women have the same accesses to education, to healthcare, to human rights that men do. It's just fundamentally important for our species' survival.
Now, another area that you address in the report is how we create ecologically sound economies, and particularly in low-income countries, this is important. You point out that ecotourism is a more equitable industry than poaching, which results in the decimation of animal species. But is it really a given that ecotourism is a sustainable option, given how much greenhouse gas emissions are associated with air travel and driving people out to see the animals in their natural environment? I'm always challenged by the suggestion that ecotourism is a way forward, because it also encourages a great deal more travel. What's the right way for us to come into contact with nature in a constructive and useful way that also supports people?
One of the things to recognize is that ecotourism doesn't necessarily have to involve air travel. There is a lot of local ecotourism. We can be ecotourists in our own neighborhoods, and certainly there are people all over the world who are ecotourists in their own neighborhoods. Importantly, though, I think as a society, we need to get away from the idea that nature needs to pay to survive. We have this idea that we need to be able to generate revenue in order to demonstrate value. And in nature's case, that's just not true. Not only do we depend on nature and ecosystems for our very life on this planet, it's already contributing huge amounts to our economy. We just don't necessarily see that in terms of revenue generated.
Right.
Reports have demonstrated that terrestrial ecosystem services alone, and I know those are some fancy words, what that means is land-based services that we rely on from ecosystems, from nature. So basically, again, soil health, that pollinating, shade from trees. So land-based services, those things that we experience on Earth, on soil, generate about the same, in terms, they're worth about the same as global GDP on an annual basis. So the global gross domestic product, the whole domestic product of the entire Earth, is about equivalent to what we get from just land-based ecosystem services. And we already have talked about how ocean-based ecosystem services are so important that they generate 50 to 80% of just our air, not to mention all of the other ecosystem services through food, carbon sequestration, and other things. So nature is already providing, let's just say, nature is already singing for her supper. Nature is already more than paying for herself. And we have to stop. We have to recognize that and stop expecting nature then to also generate revenue and put money in our pockets in other ways.
No one would actually stop their mother and say, you're just not paying the freight. But we make that argument to the planet all the time.
That's exactly right. And we have to start thinking about things in a different way and recognizing we've taken for granted for most of our lives that the things that we get from nature are infinite and will always be there. And we're starting to realize that our destruction of nature is making that untrue. And that if we do not change our behaviors on this planet, we will stop seeing the fundamental services that nature has been providing. We're already starting to see that through more drastic storms and disasters and other ways.
Well, let's talk about how to restore nature. There are a lot of initiatives, a lot of discussions at least, about restoring or rewilding the environment and restoring animal rights of way, essentially migration paths like the natural grass strips you were talking about a few minutes ago, Mark. What's the right way to think about, or right level of investment in terms of percentage of terrestrial land that we should dedicate to nature? And what would that look like? Is it a third of the world? And does that mean that there are migration paths cutting through urban cores or around them? What does it look like?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I don't think a lot of people who talk about 30 by 30 or wildlife corridors really recognize that. And to start with 30 by 30, which is the name has been given to this idea that we need to set aside 30% of our natural land and keep it from development by the year 2030, it's a good starting place. Setting aside 30% of land from development is a good starting place, but it won't be sufficient. Mm-hmm. The thing is, and I think you got to this in your question, Mitch, we have to be thinking not just about separating ourselves from nature, but how we live with and integrate into nature. Recognize that we are part of nature as human beings. We're animals too. And so when we think about perhaps setting sensitive places aside for and preventing development in those areas, that's important. But we also really need to be thinking about the ways that we are living within our communities alongside nature and coexisting with nature. What we're looking for in 30 by 30 is not that we set aside 30% of the Earth's land and prevent it from development that degrades it, and then, pave over the rest of it and, create a massive parking lot. We're thinking, let's protect sensitive areas that are absolutely necessary to preserve life on Earth going forward, like the Amazon rainforests, like the tundras and the other, areas of untouched natural beauty that provide carbon sequestration, produce air and water and all these other things. And then let's look at the areas that we inhabit and figure out how to better coexist with nature. And maybe at this point, Mark, you'll want to weigh in on some of the coexistence strategies that we work on and how important those are.
Yeah, I think thinking of the natural world and our world as separate is kind of a fallacy. We are animals, and we rely on animals in a lot of different ways, like we've talked about. And frankly, they don't rely on us. So, but it's up to us as people, since we have the advantage of critical thinking, to think of ways to make sure we can live alongside wild animals and the natural world in ways that benefit both. Animals are going to follow their instinct. And the good news is that we know their instinct. We can study them and we can understand their behavior, and we can adjust our behavior accordingly. And so that when it comes down to coexistence, really it's about, like I said before, human management. It's about adjusting our own behavior and understanding the world around us and acting accordingly.
So how would you modify, what would you add to the SDGs to inject a truly informed animal welfare ethos into our thinking about sustainability?
Specifically with the SDGs, I think specific language in each SDG that mentions wildlife or the natural world, and how a goal, each of the goals have specific indicators, maybe one or two indicators within those goals around wildlife or the environment, I think would make it clear to people, because a lot of people, they see the SDGs and they say, okay, well, we can fix hunger, we can fix by doing this, this, and this, or we can fix employment by doing this, this, and this, we can fix healthcare by doing this, this, and this, and we forget about the environment and how important it is to those goals. So having those indicators within the goals, I think, would go a long way to fixing that problem.
Turning to a slightly different but related topic, are there policies or bills before Congress or in other countries or at the UN or programs that our listeners should be paying attention to in order to contribute to protecting animal welfare and biodiversity? What are the hot topics they should follow?
That's interesting. Fortunately, this is a hot topic right now, particularly on the international stage and to some degree on the national stage as well. It's funny because this is not a new idea. This idea has the idea of our relationship with nature and the need to protect natural resources and even to value natural resources as part of our economic valuations has been around for a long time and rears its head many, many times if you go back through history. But it seems to be that it's new for our current generation of leaders and our current generation of thinkers. So some of the things that we are watching internationally are the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which has not sadly been signed by the United States, but has been signed onto by 93 nations around the world and aims to stop biodiversity loss by the year 2030 and has really gained a great deal of momentum. It's been signed by all of the countries in the European Union, for instance, by Canada, by many South American countries, and other countries within the global South. So it has a tremendous following and is really helping to shape some of the conversations among delegates to international organizations like the UN, like the WHO, and others. There's also actually a pandemic prevention agreement that the World Health Organization is working to promulgate, and it is looking, we hope, going to be looking at the relationship between nature and pandemics, something that we call One Health, the relationship between environmental health, animal health, and human health, and really looking at ways to prevent spillover, as Mark was talking about, preventing some of the human behaviors that cause spillover in the first place. Domestically, here in the United States, there are a couple of really exciting innovations. In April, on Earth Day, President Biden signed an executive order which really looked at a couple ways to bring nature into our policymaking here in the United States. One of the ways that IFA is very engaged in is valuing nature, looking at, as we were talking about earlier, how nature is already footing her own bill and then some, and how we can better integrate that valuation into our economic processes in the United States so that we're not sacrificing the long-term benefits of nature for short-term economic gains that ultimately degrade nature and cost us more in the long run, which is what we've been doing for a number of years. The administration is also looking at nature-based solutions and how better to implement those just in some of the areas that we've talked about around climate change, disaster response, and other things, recognizing that nature already has some pretty good solutions to some of the problems that we're facing and figuring out how better to support those solutions so that we are not trying, again, as we've done, to combat nature, but rather to work with nature to benefit human health and well-being. There's also a resolution that's been introduced in the House of Representatives, House Resolution 69, that would create a national biodiversity strategy to really prioritize biodiversity and nature at all levels of government. That's something that IFA has been very, very engaged in. And among other pieces of legislation, there's a bill that would implement a national wildlife corridor strategy. So helping to connect some of those natural spaces. We didn't get to this in the earlier question, and that's my fault. We should have. When we set aside protected areas, that's great. But if we don't connect them to one another, then we essentially just create little islands where we're stranding plants and animals that are unable to connect with one another. It's like, we can survive pretty happily in our homes for a while, as we've learned during lockdowns from COVID. But if we can't get out to go to the store or see other people, eventually we're going to go crazy. And honestly, eventually we would die off. And the same is true for animal populations. So wildlife corridors, they don't necessarily mean that we have sort of a green space roadway that connects one protected area to another. What it means is that maybe we change the way we're fencing some areas, or we create overpasses or underpasses under busy roads. We makes, in many cases, very small tweaks to ensure that animal and plant species can migrate through protected area, or from one protected area to another, in order to meet others of their species, to access food and water, particularly important in changing environments, and just to go about their daily business in ways that don't bring them into conflict with human beings. So that's another piece of legislation that we're very supportive of. Another policy that we're really working on with both the administration and Congress.
Now, our listeners are about to finish this podcast and close down their app. What can they do when they're done today to make a difference? What do you suggest?
I love that question, Mitch. First thing, just supporting representatives that, at the polls and, with your voices that align with this vision, that are, voting for the things or introducing bills that align with integrating, nature, wildlife, and people. Mm-hmm. But also, they can do practical things too. Like one thing that I is like my own personal thing is I think lawns are, your typical ornamental lawn that you see in the United States a lot is an ecological disaster. If everyone replaced their lawn in the U.S. with native grasslands or meadows, we wouldn't really have much of a pollinator problem. It would improve water quality. It would improve water retention during droughts. It would prevent floods during high water events, more biodiversity. And that's something you can do on your own if you have a lawn. And even if you don't have a lawn, let's say you live in an apartment building, even just a few native plants on your windowsill can provide that key stopover point for a butterfly, or a key pollen source for bees. We can all do our part. And at the local level, I know a lot of homeowners associations require lawns these days. Advocating at your HOA, your condominium association, things like that. A lot of cities, I know, we're here in the District of Columbia. I know there's a nonprofit and a city program that helps people convert lawns to native plants, because they know that we have two rivers that run through our city, the Potomac and Anacostia, and they've had water quality problems for years and years. They know that replacing lawns with native plants would go a huge way to cleaning those rivers up and preventing some of the flooding issues that we have. So there's a lot of these groups help people convert. There's some great resources out there. So that's something I really push in my personal life and professional life.
That's great advice and concrete actions that people can take. I want to thank both of you for taking time to talk with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mitch. It's been a great conversation. We really appreciate you having us.
Yeah, any chance to to talk about this stuff, and I'm here.
Well, thank you. We've been speaking with Kate Wall and Mark Hofberg of the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and also contributors to the recent report, Thriving Together, the Critical Role of Animals in Achieving the SDGs. So we've heard that biodiversity is the basis of the web of life, and need to recognize that when you remove even a few nodes from a network, it can make the entire system fragile. And unfortunately, we've removed hundreds of species from the natural world in which we evolved, and the cost is falling on all of us, but particularly on women, on animals, on children who have also benefited from increased access to agricultural income in the emerging world. And of course, all of us are exposed to greater dangers from zoonotic diseases that a resilient nature, when left alone, can help prevent. So what do? Let nature do its thing. Let it flow. Let the network work and open more of our world to the wildlife that provides such a rich basis for our human life. Take a few minutes to learn about the Leaders Pledge for Nature and send a note to the White House at whitehouse.gov asking the U.S. sign on to the agreement. Write your legislators and ask them to support the National Biodiversity Strategy and National Wildlife Corridors ideas that are before Congress now. We'll be back soon with another innovator interview. In the meantime, I hope you take a few minutes to share this podcast and all the others that we've done with your family, friends, and community. Let's get these ideas out there and keep the momentum going for nature. Sustainability in Your Ear is available on all the popular podcast platforms, so please share. Thanks for your attention today. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Please, while we are apart, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.